Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Leaders in Value Chain podcast. I am your host, Radu Palamariu, Group CEO at Elcott Global. It's my pleasure and delight to have with us today Jackie Sturm, who's the Corporate Vice President for Global Operations at Intel. Jackie has had an illustrious career with Intel many years, close to 32 really. And what's interesting is that she spent a big chunk of that in finance. So up to 2010, she was in various positions in finance, ultimately ended as VP of Finance, linked to supply chain operations and manufacturing division specifically. And then she made the switch in 2010 to become the Vice President for Global Supply at the time. And now, as shared, she is the Corporate Vice President for Global Operations. Jackie, pleasure to have you and thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
So as a start, first and foremost, let's talk about you and your career. And there's inflection points typically when you look back and you think to yourself, wow, this made a lot of difference to where I am today. What are those inflection points for you, Jackie?
Well, I have to tell you, I did not start out in my career development plans to become a financial person or to become a supply chain leader. In fact, my original dream was to be a country singer in a cowboy bar. Unfortunately, over time, I realized that this dream was not going to pay my bills. So naturally, I went to the next best career, which was to move into finance and economics. I have to say that the direction worked out great for me. I had a lot of inflection points, but I have to say I was tremendously lucky to have the opportunity to learn many valuable lessons from industry icons like Bill Hewlett, Andy Grove, Steve Jobs, during what I call my tour of Silicon Valley. I was able to see how the founders at HP focused on strong, predictable business operations. And then I went to what was the first fabless company. And I learned at this very small, very cash-strapped startup that cash is always king, whether you're in a fledgling business or you're an established Fortune 50 company. I also spent 7 years at Apple right after the founders left. And when I was there, I learned the fundamental importance of a clear mission and the value that comes from designing and delivering a great customer experience. And now, as you mentioned, after nearly 32 years at Intel, roughly half in finance and half in supply chain, I've had a front row seat to seeing how companies execute through times of crisis and can come out stronger in the long term. I have a couple of challenges I could spell out if you'd like.
Yes, please. I'd love to hear that.
Yeah, I talk about two in particular. In my personal career, the first one was the dot-com bubble burst when I was in finance. And then the other is in my earliest year of my supply chain career when the great Japanese earthquake, which was a 9.0 earthquake, and tsunami hit our ecosystem. So if I start with the dot-com bubble, I was just stepping in as CFO for our technology and manufacturing group, which had been on an unprecedented capacity expansion. And that was predicated based on industry demand projections that heralded the idea that it's different this time. And what I have learned over the years is that cycles are almost never different this time. And that proved to be the case once again in 2000. So as a CFO, I had to work day and night to retrench on, just starting expansion projects to tamp them down. I had to return equipment. I had to reset demand plans and implement a new capital efficiency drive for the company. Unfortunately, I was also responsible to write off billions of dollars in excess capacity charges while we worked through that bow wave to drive industry-leading return on invested capital. And all in all, this effort cut about $8 billion in capital investments in the first year and also helped to establish a high productivity framework that lasted for the next 10 years. It really made me focus on the supply chain. That was sort of the inflection point that had me start to really engage more closely with the supply chain. And then my next memorable challenge was when I was just starting out after transitioning from finance. And although I was tightly connected to the supply chain, as I mentioned, controlling something versus managing and optimizing, those are two very different responsibilities. And as a company, Intel leverages the high precision equipment, the industrial quality silicon, the world's most specialized electronic packaging, as well as the high purity chemical industries that are mainstays of Japan's semiconductor ecosystem. So when the earthquake struck, I was actually in Narita and waiting for my plane to depart. Luckily, though, I had a BlackBerry at the time, and that was the only network that was up and able to establish connections. So I contacted my home office and handed off near-term crisis management to my second in command while I got on the last plane out of town. On my return, I was able to work with critical technology and operations partners to ensure that we could continue to deliver to customers without a hitch. This was one of my most intense learning experiences in supply management. And I have to say, even though it was built upon a tragic circumstance, it was wonderful and so developmental for me to get an initial glimpse at the scale and the complexity of our supply chain when we needed it most.
What a great example of a story to forge you in your career. Now, also, I wanted to ask you, Jackie, specifically about your background coming from finance. Tell us a little bit about how it helped you, perhaps, when you went into supply chain, and how did that strong financial acumen play out in your advantage?
Well, one of the things that is really important, and when the CEO and the chairman of the board asked me to move from finance into supply chain operations, one of the things that they told me is, "Hey, Jackie, we want you to bring more strategic thinking to the organization, but you won't be without tools because cash is king there in supply chain, just as it is in finance." And so having that understanding was very important. I always worked closely with the technology teams, which has a large investment space, whether it's critical materials or it's, individual equipment, which can cost up to $300 million a piece. So I was closely engaged with that. Understanding the balance sheet, understanding the financial model, understanding what trade-offs P&L owners have to make, and being able to help shape plans that are going to be consistent with achieving return on invested capital, achieving gross margin, supporting cash management. All of those elements have worked really well for me. And, over the years, it also helped me develop a sense of sometimes you just got to be tough. And people don't always want to see finance coming. They're kind of, trying to avoid that. And so over the years, I've learned that it's important to just say what needs to be said. And if that means we've got to select a different supplier, if we're not going to be able to continue with an investment opportunity, or in fact, if we need an individual to help, improve their personal performance, I've learned to be straight in those conversations. And I think it is very helpful.
Yes.
So there's so much I think I bring from finance. It's been a great foundation for me. And it's so intrinsically connected to a supply chain, which is driving planning, driving revenue, driving cost structure, managing the balance sheet, delivering, great free cash flow. So it's been a real asset to me to bring to the party.
Now, moving a little bit to talk about Intel supply chain specifically, there's a couple of case studies that I'd love to get your sharing on because you've worked on many. We've talked a little bit on conflict minerals, and I think there's quite a great story that you have to share there in terms of what Intel has done to address that. So please tell us more.
Okay, so doing well by doing good sounds simple, I think, to most people, but it's definitely something that's a little more complicated than I think is obvious on the surface. So back in 2008, we at Intel were approached by an NGO called the Enough Project, and they shared with us the difficult and dangerous conditions that were facing artisanal miners in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. These miners were, digging for what were called the conflict minerals, tantalum, tin, tungsten, and gold. And when the Enough Project shared with us that armed militants were systematically terrorizing the civilian miners so that they could profit on the proceeds of their labor, we knew we had to do something. Miners were being forced to harvest those minerals, and their profits were then seized to finance more armed conflict in the region. So we knew that our business was not willing to support this and be a part of, driving profits toward those insurgents. When our CEO learned about this situation, he was, of course, shocked and appalled that any of our investments, even multiple tiers down in our supply chain, were contributing to the problem. So at that point, without any data, without any action plan, he declared Intel would commit to deliver all microprocessors free of conflict minerals. And this was in 2009. And he said by 2012, we would have all the tantalum removed. And by 2013, we would have removed all of the conflict minerals. And we stood back and applauded because wanting to do great things is wonderful. But then we had to figure out how to do it. When a CEO makes a very public commitment, that usually means that the supply chain has to engage. And frankly, we had no idea of how to solve the problem. We were not direct customers for the minerals. We'd never been to a mine before. Almost none of our teams had ever been to the DRC, nor had we ever talked to a miner about the challenges that they faced. And all of this was before legislation like the Dodd-Frank Act and Sarbanes-Oxley were in place to drive enforcement. So what we did is we started by listening and learning so that we could understand. We invested as a team more than 250,000 miles of travel around the world so that we could talk to the miners. We could see the conditions ourselves, and then we could actually walk the flow and say, from digging in the dirt all the way to being installed in a PC or an iPhone, what happens? And what we heard ranged pretty widely from supplier to supplier. But the conversations helped us identify that the smelter was the last point of differentiation, and that was critical to our success.
Yes.
That's a place where the raw minerals from multiple sources are processed to create the pure minerals. And that's when you lose your ability to trace back to the source. So what we did is working with the miners, working with the local government, working with our industrial engineering teams and so on, we designed a chain of custody program, which included a tamper-proof bag and tag, a mass balance process that ensured that legitimately sourced materials went to the smelters. There was also audited by us and by third parties to make sure that the chain of custody hadn't been disrupted. And so then we had a framework and a process that we could start to work with our suppliers because it had to be cascaded down. We didn't know any smelters. So this meant that we needed others to work with us because I think anybody who's tried to knows that a single company can't drive global change, especially when they're a small user compared to other industries. We didn't use a lot of minerals, except tantalum was the biggest. That's why we started there. So our challenge was, how do you get others to come along with you and help drive this action so that your collective impact is amplified? Well, I think it relies on a couple of things. One is influencing, and the second is creating a path of least resistance for others to follow to simplify them moving forward. So in order to be influential, as well as to create that path, you need to understand the landscape and then craft your engagement in the context of who are the decision makers in those fellow travelers or those governmental organizations. Where are the real decisions being made? Is it really in the meeting? Is it really behind the scenes somewhere? Is the finance department making the decision? You have to understand that. You also have to know, what are the pain points for your fellow travelers? What trade-offs do they have to make in order to come along with you? And what are their motivations? And how can you maybe work through navigating these points to come to something where you have an alignment in principles? So we walked through all of these and we talked with other stakeholders. And we did realize that many companies were horrified as well, and they wanted to act, but they had two obstacles. They didn't know how, and they were worried about the cost. So we established industry meetings. We participated with a number of industry associations and working groups and educated our fellow travelers. And then we also shared our framework, the bag and tag, the mass balance, the audit of the chain of custody, and said, participate with us, use this model. We will make this readily available. And so by addressing the trade-offs and learning what their concerns were through listening, we were able to get to consensus quickly toward an ecosystem-wide approach. Probably the part that was most wonderful to me was the fact that the smelters, who had no benefit from doing this, also came along with no regulatory influencing and just the premise that they did not want to participate in something that was so abusive to others. And so the alignment of all of these parties effectively created an economic embargo. And in that first year that we started working on tantalum, we were told by the Enough Project that our efforts had taken 49%, almost half of the profit out of tantalum. And so the insurgents moved elsewhere to work on things. So that work did culminate into, for me, a magical scene. During Intel's keynote at CES in January 2014, our CEO was able to announce that from that day forward, every single microprocessor made by Intel would be completely free of conflict minerals.
Now, what a story that is. And I was actually in New York at the World Economic Forum a few weeks ago. During a meeting there, there was a sharing from one of the business leaders to say that the European Union has passed a few pieces of legislation to enforce on companies to check that there's no forced labor in their supply chains. Now, of course, that makes sense, and we none of us want that in our supply chain. The problem is with how do you check among 7, 8, 9 tiers of your suppliers that there is no issues, and that's very costly. It takes a lot of technology, it takes a lot of effort, and companies, if you have to do it by yourself, it obviously takes a lot of cost as well. So it becomes almost impractical to be able to do it thoroughly. And in that sense, it becomes way better when you manage to get the ecosystem together, like it seems that Intel has done in the case of the case study you shared, when you manage to get all the different parties come together to work together. And that's something that works way better and more practical. And I think that, the World Economic Forum would love to hear from you, Jackie, because it seems like you found the solution to how to do it well.
Yeah, I would love to talk with them because, we've actually done quite a lot of work on forced and bonded labor to try to ensure that our factories don't have any of this situation, and certainly that our suppliers, particularly the contractors who work for them in areas like an ODM or in the space of construction projects where they tend to bring a lot of foreign workers, we have applied multiple aspects to try to make it beneficial to others, as well as make them feel like, boy, this is a requirement to do business with Intel. In particular, I'm so proud over the years, as we identified third parties were the agents for some of the outsourced manufacturing companies that support the electronics industry. We were able to work with a variety of the folks in the Responsible Business Alliance, the RBA, to identify where some of the suppliers were using foreign labor that had been sourced by agents. And those agents were putting them in substandard housing. There was black mold on the walls. They had corporal punishment if people didn't meet their productivity goals. They had brought on workers who were maybe Bangladeshi, and they got contracts in other languages, and it told them they were going to be an engineer, and then when they arrived, they were doing something dramatically less, and they had to pay for their work. Their passports were taken, and sometimes even the ventilation was reduced in their living quarters as a punishment. And through our process, where we shared with people and educated what goes on, our US counterparts, who were mostly the headquarters, didn't even realize how the agents were sourcing their workforce. They were paying money for good food and good accommodations, but that was not going to support the workers. And then we also said, by the way, we expect you to take these specific actions. And companies that voluntarily did it, great. Companies that did not do it, even after we audited them, they showed up in our CSR report, our corporate sustainability report, as non-compliant. And I can tell you, using all of those levers, educating, appealing to people's corporate reputation, and then driving a tangible process to audit and measure performance really works. For the time of our process, so far, we've returned $27 million to 28,000 workers across different tiers in the supply chain, and every single one of them has their passport available to them today. So you do have to understand the motivations. Once again, if you want to influence, you need to understand who makes the decisions, what trade-offs they have to make, and how do you influence them in a way that corresponds with meeting their best needs.
Also, I wanted to talk a little bit about the case study on relationships. I think it's a big theme, collaboration. You were sharing with me how you also went a little bit and you progressed through your career to really think, coming from finance into supply chain, to think win-win with your ecosystem, with your partners. So tell us more about that, Jackie.
Yeah, when I first moved into the supply chain from finance, I scoffed at the idea of win-win. I figured it's a one person wins and one person loses, and I need to be the winner. But after 15 years, I am a convert. Think about it this way. Imagine your company is in a crisis and you need to make a call to a colleague, a supplier, a customer, or even a regulator for assistance. Are they going to take your call? Are they going to work with you and give you the benefit of the doubt? Or are they going to take advantage of your situation to negotiate terms? Over the years, I've become convinced that sincere collaboration is the glue to keep the supply chain and the value chain delivering value. During the pandemic, we often had to go to great extremes to support our customers. One example of extreme multi-party collaboration was when one of our critical customers needed a key component to help deliver their quarter end push. But this is pretty complicated. The parts were in the US. They had to go to Malaysia for some processing. Then they had to go to Shenzhen for ODM, and then they had to ship to customers. I think we know at the height of the pandemic, almost all real-time logistics were either unavailable or so prohibitively expensive, companies weren't able to invest in them. Transit into mainland China was also tightly restricted. And we also had no time to do the normal problem solving. So after a few testy meetings held at 2 a.m., 10 p.m., and 4 p.m. across our different regions all at once, we got creative. Intel completed the wafers in our fabrication facility in Oregon. A supplier team picked up the parts and flew them to Malaysia for additional processing. From there, the parts were flown via a board member's private plane to Hong Kong. And then one of my local employees rented a van in Hong Kong and drove the parts across the border into Shenzhen and hand delivered the components to the ODM. And then he waited to take them back to Hong Kong, where they were shipped to the end customer. Our direct customer was able to reach their end of quarter goal as a result of 3 committed teams working together. And to me, that's the kind of relationship that enables joint success, not just one time, but routinely. When each of you know the other will come through for you when times are good and when times are bad, the relationships are stronger, and ultimately your supply chain is so much more resilient.
What a story. Now, I also want to reinforce, because most of this seems common sense. Unfortunately, common sense is not common practice. And I specifically know about a very large company, 20 billion revenue wise company. They had one supplier, and at that point, the supplier, which was a very long term type of a partnership relationships with them, there was a change of leadership. So even if the company was spending more than $1 billion worth of revenue for that supplier, the new leadership in the supplier wanted to take advantage of a situation that occurred to increase their rates. There was a change on the sales leadership. They increased the rates, even if the client, my contact, told them, look, I mean, yes, right now, sure, I will pay you more, but when the time is right, because the time will come and that the tables will turn, I will definitely not do this, and I will cut our relationships. And nevertheless, the supplier insisted. And what do you think happened 2 years down the line? The client, my contact, tables changed, the environment changed, the power was again with them, and they just completely dropped that 1 billion spent from that supplier. So sometimes, this collaboration, whilst it does sound like common sense, people just don't really do it. They take a short-term stance instead of the long-term, and it always on the long term is going to come and haunt you.
Yeah, I want to just reflect on that Japanese earthquake and tsunami. When the earthquake struck, about half of the type of silicon that we use at Intel, it's called epitaxial silicon, the supply went down hard. 50% of the world's supply was in the island of Kyushu. And on my BlackBerry, which was able to connect, while we were still having aftershocks, I called that supplier. And first I found out whether they were safe. And after that, said, hey, I will pay extra. Can you guarantee my supply? And they said, I will guarantee your supply. I will not charge you extra. And we will work together later to figure out if there's any premiums that we had to invest to make it happen. But for now, be assured that your supply is solid. And that had that had such an impact on our company, because every chip starts with silicon. And if we didn't have that, we would have been down hard as well. And that relationship was everything.
Now, Jackie, on the topic of people, I wanted to ask you, especially in this AI going to take over type of discussions. Obviously, for good reason, AI will transform and changes the way that we do things. But what type of skills do we as employees really need to invest in ourselves, particularly in supply chain and operations, to make sure we stay relevant 3, 5, 10 years down the line?
Well, I'm going to say, in spite of the fact that this is sort of an AI and a digital kind of conversation, I'm going to say that ensuring you are capable of critical thinking and that you are always trying to look at the big problem is important. That critical thinking is important, whether you had to chase down data and have very limited time to be able to analyze it, or if you're swimming in data, as we are today in an AI world, and you need to just be able to parse it. People who can think at the bigger picture and combine that with digital fluency and analytical skills, those are the people who are going to be successful today, tomorrow, and well into the future. It's always been those people who are most effective. The change in dimension that we experience right now is that in the past, we spent most of our time chasing down data. Now we are, floating in a sea of data and trying to figure out which data is relevant. And I think we've all heard the horror stories of, the AI hallucinations. I think recently there was something where a leading semiconductor company was conducting a show in Taiwan, and the AI was being used as an example, and it said we were in a high school in some other town. So trying to understand that the fact that you have data doesn't mean it's right. The fact that it draws conclusions doesn't mean it's right. The fact that the answer might be right for somebody doesn't mean it's right for you. So being somebody who can think critically, if you can program in Python, that's great too. but being able to use the data to query the data by asking the right questions and then critically thinking about what the conclusions are and then applying it using good judgment around the context of your business and the environment that you're in. That is what I think people need to really focus on. And some of that comes from, experience. Some of it comes from learning from others. Some of it comes from education, but building your judgment to complement with data and logic, that is a great combination.
Now, final question from myself, which is geared towards the younger generation. People listening to this that are now stepping in their careers and maybe one day they want to become a C-level executive like yourself. What would be some pieces of advice you would give to them?
Okay, I have 3 pieces of advice. The first one is cast your net broadly as you're developing your career. Today, your heart may be all in on the supply chain, and that is a great career. But understanding the larger environment in which supply chains operate and that they enable by taking on selective other assignments can increase your insight and your professional capabilities. Maybe you rotate into the sales team. Maybe you take a tour in finance, you work in the factory, and maybe you shift the various supply chain functions of planning, sourcing, data analytics. Doing all of that can help you inform your own decision making by providing a deeper context into what matters. What are the pressures that practitioners face in those roles? And how can you optimize among the associated variables? I think it's a great way to propel your career as you become more adept at working with all of these partners due to the credibility and the knowledge that comes from actually doing the real work of these important teams and partners. Next, piece of advice number 2 is, I hate to break it to you on the line, but the reality is that at the end of the day, we all work for finance. No matter what company you're at, no matter what function you're in, no one is going to fund you for an unquantified good idea. You have to connect the dots to the corporate strategy, the business model, the customer need, and the bottom line. Finance may be challenging sometimes to get investment from, but they're not against great ideas. They just need to show a return on investment. And I think it's our job in the supply chain and all the functions, frankly, to treat finance as a partner and work with them to unearth the real incremental value that can be created for the business and deliver meaningful value to our customers. And that may come in the form of design wins, efficiency, or even a step level increase in productivity. So once again, just like working with partners in relationships, collaborating for results will achieve better outcomes. And then my last piece of advice is your career is likely to be long. So find your passion. Work on things that matter to you. Find the fun in the job. Every job has something to teach you and colleagues who share your goals and want to learn from you. And then learn from your failures. They're great teachers. And finally, pay it forward. If someone has helped you out in your career, lend that same helping hand to others. And I think you'll find that that's a reward in itself.
Love it. Jackie, these are wonderful pieces of advice. Thanks a lot for joining us today, for the many stories shared, and it's been a delight having you with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. If you liked what you heard, be sure to go to www.elcotglobal.com and click the podcast button for all the show notes of the interview. Also, subscribe to our mailing list to get our latest updates first. If you're listening through a streaming platform like iTunes, Spotify, or Stitcher, we would appreciate a kind review. 5-star works best to keep us going and our production team happy. And of course, share it with your friends. I'm most active on LinkedIn, so do feel free to follow me. And if you have any suggestions on what to do and who to invite next, don't hesitate to drop me a note. And if you're looking to hire top executives or transform your business, of course, contact us as well to find out how we can help.